Hello everyone, and welcome to this sort of overview looking at and asking the question really, coping, is this the foundation? Is this the foundation of well-being? Uh, this works in around this works a little bit of a little bit of an overview to begin with. So for several years there have been a proliferation in around coping research across sort of behavioral sciences, clinical medicine, public health, and nursing, and sort of nursing research. A few authors have also strived to forward understanding and sort of exploring the interactions through laboratory investigations. These explorations have been these investigations have been sort of crucial because coping and stress research was once seen as almost two-dimensional when really coping should perhaps be viewed three or even four-dimensionally and across specialties. Central to health and disease mechanisms must intertwine, especially in young people facing chronic illnesses such as chronic kidney disease. The objective of this work was to identify whether coping is actually the foundation behind well-being by exploring different models and theories. So the different sort of coping and sort of stress models, if you like, put forward in this works from 2010. This collaborative works from 2010 was the Hanselli general adaptation general adaptation syndrome from 1936. Solomon and Rudolph Moose George Solomon and Rudolph Moose's sort of works Lazarus's harm, threat, and challenge works from 1966. George Engels' a biopsychosocial model in 1977. Folkman and Lazarus's sort of positive emotions works in 1980, 1985, and 1997. And the works in around the neuro the works in around the psychoneuroimmunology concept, PNI concept, and then in around sort of the diathesis stress model, and then sort of a hypothetical model in around coping as part of the sort of the concluding parts to this works. So Hansen's adaptation syndrome, general adaptation syndrome from 1936. Hanseli postulated that a stressor external stressor, an external stressor triggers the hypothalamus gland, the hypothalamus and the glands around the hypothalamus, and then subsequently the pituitary gland, and then where the hypothalamus gland and the pituitary gland sort of synchronously are then in around pathophysiology or physiology are referred to as the hypothalamic adrenal axis, or HPA, and then where the HPA then triggers the adrenal glands, and then the adrenal glands then affect how the gut and how the stomach reacts, how the thymus and lymph nodes how the thymus and lymph nodes react, and then sort of in line with how the gut and the stomach act. The stomach and the gut are in from the adrenal glands. Then with the thymus and lymph nodes, then how sort of certain cells and markers of different cell types within physiology react. So, for example, how white blood cells are affected, how red blood cells are affected, how sort of immunological markers are affected as well. In early works, intriguingly, there had not been sort of a sort of investigation in looking at sort of immunological biomarker markers such as chemokines or chemokine receptors in early works around stress in stress sort of in sorry in around coping and stress in around 2003. In around 2000, in the mid 2000 or early 2000s, there have been works by authors Redwin, who looks at sort of certain chemokine certain specific certain chemokine receptors, also receptors in line with stress, and sort of certain aspects around sort of around sort of the psychology and how stress how certain markers or certain chemokine receptors are affected are sort of propagated in line with certain hematological parameters, and how hematological parameters can be affected. However, in this works, some of the earlier investigations around coping and stress. So, Selle's general adaptation syndrome, or GAS, or gas, the sort of gas model, gas sort of the gas sort of theory or model looks at sort of the a link between the psychological and physiological aspects around coping sort of theory and works. And then between 19 in the 1960s, around the mid 1960s to the late 1960s, George Solomon and Rudolf Moose um, looked at sort of emotions, immunity and disease through the central nervous system to understand stress and coping. And these investigators look at sort of the production of auto antibody in a rheumatoid arthritis model to understand immunological and especially sort of autoimmunity and sort of disturbances with psychology. And the major theoretical point was autoimmunity may be related to a relative increase in immunological components, The increase might be related to coping or emotional effect associated with the elevation of corticoid steroid hormones. And so following the works from George Solomon and Rudolf Muse between 1964 and 1969. The works by Lazarus's Harm, Threat, and Challenge in 1966 looked at where Lazarus's works had drawn a distinction among three kinds of stress. Number one, harm. Number two, threat, and three, challenge. Number one was where harm refers to the psychological damage that had already been done. Number two was threat. Threat is the sort of the anticipation of that which has not yet taken place but imminent. And three looks at challenge and the results from difficult demands that an individual may feel confident about overcoming by effectively mobilizing and developing sort of coping resources. And then there was works in around sort of George Engel's a biopsychosocial social model. And George Engel George Engel George Engel's George Engel's biopsychosocial model looks at from around 1977, looked at sort of a link between looked at a link between Sally's general adaptation syndrome in 1936, and looked at um, uh, where where uh, where where the link of the where George Engel's psychosocial model had a had a link between the central part of the central nervous system, or the central nervous system, the in around physiology and pathophysiology, and also in around in around what had been referred to as the spirit, however, in sort of more in sort of more in sort of a more in sort of a more sort of lay from a lay perspective, spirit can the spirit can be linked to, for example, part of the part of where for example where for example Hanseni looks at where Hanseni previously looked at sort of the link between sort of the sort of the immune the parts of the immune system, and also and also the and parts of the adrenal glands and hypothalamus, and where the spirit was in George Engel's biopsychosocial model, was is where is where George Engel had propagated at least that the whole a whole person should be treated. And if a whole person is treated, rather than for example, and then specifically just the ailment, just where clinicians, for example, where clinicians look at the sort of clinical or the clinical aspect. George Engels' a psychosocial model from 1977 had propagated a basis to ensure that a whole person is looked at rather than just the clinical aspects. So thus, in treating and propagating appropriate sort of medical practice medical practices or sort of clinical practices or sort of ensuring general care according to recipients. George Engels' biopsychosocial model looks at propagated a basis in sort of the whole person, and seeing that and encouraging sort of the holistic aspects around around patient care. So thus that there's synchronicity between the mind, the body, and the spirit. Um, um, and then from George Engels' model the George Engels biopsychosocial model from 1977, there was then Folkman's and Lazarus's positive emotions sort of model and works from 1985, and 1977. Not sorry, 1997, where where they informed that there where it had been informed that there is substantial evidence that positive emotions are a normative aspect of the coping process, and that they help restore physiological and psychosocial coping resources. And less is known about the sort of full range of coping processes, including the content, timing, and duration, which are associated with the regulation of positive as opposed to negative emotions. Evidence does suggest that underlying beliefs, values, goals, are heavily implicated in coping processes. And so thus sort of following on from Folkman and Lazarus positive emotions work from 1980, 1985, and 1997. There was then a sort of there was then more there's more within sort of medical literature and clinical literature to a clinical literature amongst other sort of specialties, if you like, a sort of a propagation to then link aspects around the psychosocial model, aspects around the general adaptation syndrome from Hanselli from 1936, and sort of some aspects in around Folkman and Lazarus's works, and before George Solomon and Rudolf Moose's work from 1964 to around 1969, where then there was a sort of a propagation where within and amongst the literature there was more research work was more research work that had focused on a link between, for example, the neuroendocrine system, the immune system, and also in around psychology, and thus linking the specialties, the linking the specialties, the psychoneuroimmunology, psychoneuroimmunology concept became sort of a became sort of a an aspect amongst the literature where the psychoneuroimmunology concept was referred or has been referred to as the PNI concept, and where the PNI concept is a link between sort of the nervous, again, sort of the nervous system, the immune system, and the endocrine system, and where amongst the literature and in works that link sort of laboratory sort of investigations, as well as sort of works in around where investigations have delved into sort of works in amongst specific diseases, and participants in specific and amongst specific diseases, where diseases and sort of conditions, and where uh, where but where investigators and researchers have looked at sort of the nervous system, the immune system, and the endocrine system, and sort of where in from one perspective to understand a link between disease and health, but also a link to understand how disease is can be sort of can be sort of looked at, and where patient care can be or could be better, could be better. There have been works that link the PNI concept, the psychoneuroimmunology concept, if you like, with something that's been referred to as the diathesis stress model. The diathesis stress model takes into consideration both sort of predisposing characteristics of an individual and an investigating event. So the model proposes the diathesis stress model prompts that the impact of an initiating event is perhaps more likely to contribute to a disability or chronic illness to those who interpret symptoms as indicative of serious problems. So activities that increase pain tend to be avoided. What this means generally, is that is that is that owing to what is potentially anticipated, those who for example, those who sort of before anticipating, those who for example, those who view, for example, or hear, for example, even that an antis that an that a particular aspect of a particular aspect is what a particular aspect can cause can potentially cause harm without even anticipating what the diathesis stress model sort of propagates, is that such activities or aspects are generally avoided by individuals, even without sort of anticipating. And so and so and so these sort of at risk people believe that all activities that cause increased symptoms, or those that are anticipated to those cause injury, should be avoided. This model can be sort of utilized to integrate sort of factors in around with coping in for example, in young people with particular conditions. So for example, again, in around chronic kidney disease, and in pediatrics and in young people. In the original works, in the original works, this some of the aspects around this had not been sort of highlighted. However, in pediatrics and young people, owing to the sort of young nature of pediatrics and young people, the diathesis stress model can be utilized to integrate sort of factors around coping, owing to the fact that, for example, for example, much like physiology, pathophysiology, and the immune system. For example, in young people, the aspects around sort of the sort of basis in around physiology, physiology, the immune system, etc. All these bases of young people are basically parts, are aspects that are in young people are developing, are sort of generally developing. And so the diathesis stress model in this context is where young people, because it's still young people are still developing, they are not able to, they cannot anticipate, whereas anticipate as much, whereas in adults, where after a certain time, the uh, uh, adults can sorry adults have an ability to anticipate. So the diathesis stress model can be useful, but in this works in this sort of published works, the diathesis stress model is perhaps more applicable in young people with specific diseases, with specific conditions, or specific long-standing conditions, long-standing conditions, and sort of the diseases, owing to in an adult population, again, to iterate again, that at-risk people believe that all activities can cause symptoms, or those that are anticipated to cause injury should be avoided, wherein young people, owing to the basis that young people are developing, are sort of developing through, in around different aspects of physiology, pathophysiology, and the immune system, or immunology. For example, the young people generally sort of for example, do in around sort of approaching activities, do not have a basis in around to anticipate sort of aspects around injury, and where things should be avoided, although where things should be avoided, generally, is down to where young people have sort of parents and guardians, etc. So in around sort of the sort of in sort of in around and sort of following some concluding aspects around this sort of this works. So quite clearly, coping calls for a sort of a deeper and more intricate understanding, especially in children and young people whom are facing chronic illnesses such as chronic kidney disease, or CKD. And to understand coping models and theories, to understand coping models and theories require further explanation and scrutinizing accordingly. And there are no official, there are no official sort of coping models. The foundation behind a good behind a good well-being and quality of life is coping. And so to conclude, the mind, the and so and so thus to conclude, as part of this, a part of this works, there is a this works. There have been a hypothetical model of coping, which is where at the basis of a for example, at the basis of a triangle, for example, you have, let's say, at the basis you have coping, and where coping has two stems. It has two stems. There's the physiological side of coping, and then there's the psychological side of coping. Now, the hypothetical model of coping in this published works, or in this works, informs that at the basis you have coping from both physiological and psychological side. And if for example, coping is 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 approached well, or approached decently, then young people then young people can then be determined to have a sense of have a decent sort of a sense of well-being, and then once sort of coping and well-being have been approached, then a young person then at the top part of the triangle of this hypothetical model around coping, a person then has a decent a good quality of life, or QOL, a decent QOL. Now, retrospectively in literature, sort of before this works, in around certain long-standing conditions, in around pediatric works, or pediatric pediatric disease, pediatric focused diseases, etc. The literature delves right into looking at sort of quality of life. So at the same time, the published works, by sort of where this works looks at varying sort of coping and sort of stress sort of models. Um, um, the works the this the work this sort of works should informs to a sort of to a sort of a an extent that where literature has delved right into works around quality of life and assessing quality of life in pediatrics and young people in specific diseases or specific conditions, understanding sort of the coping aspects of individual is more important than for example jumping sort of where researchers and investigators historically and retrospectively have delved right into looking at quality of life, when it's impossible, it's impossible to understand, it's impossible to understand, or has been impossible to understand how a young person's quality of life is, if at the basis that investigators or researchers across different specialties and disciplines are not able to understand sort of appreciate sort of the coping aspects of individuals at sort of at the basis of work. And argumentatively or debatably, the investigators can say, for example, coping is subjective, is different for everyone, etc., etc. And then the basis around this is that at the same time, owing to the different aspects around different diseases, different long-standing conditions, etc., 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 quality of life sort of skips over not just aspects around coping and aspects around, for example, coping around physiologically or psychologically, but also skips over aspects around well-being, and thus again quality of life, and looking at quality of life, where quality of life sort of investigations have looked at different markers, and sort of markers of markers of sort of markers of sort of trajectory around young people and in around specific diseases and conditions, different diseases and conditions, and where so and so thus for example, where quality of life markers look at aspects that are applicable and that are in literature are perhaps more applicable to aspects that pertain to adult pertain to aspects around adults adult aspects of adult markers of adult sort of markers around quality of life, and so thus in pediatrics and young people's research, investigators should be prompted or encouraged to look at sort of again sort of the coping aspects of young people going through particular diseases. And there are investigators and researchers that have delved into quality of life. Delved into quality of life where investigations have been somewhat in a lot of detail, and so thus and so thus and so thus there are some sort of references linked to this works, read listeners can check out sort of relating or regarding works, in around some regarding works to this, for further information. Thank you.